Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. The title of my talk today is Women, Population Discourses, and Environmental Injustice in the Global South. This title already says a lot about where I'm coming from. In this presentation, I want to share with you my research, which questions the way the narrative of overpopulation has been used as an explanation for environmental problems. I will do so from a perspective that highlights the impacts on women's lives. My argument is that this narrative is not only weak in its ability to explain the ecological crisis, but it also reinforces inequalities for women in the global south. And it also deepens the divide between north and south. So I ask for you for your patience, as this talk might feel quite different from the others in this conference. My hope is that by the end, you will be able to understand how some environmental discourses, such as this one, can be dangerous and not only fail to understand complex issues, but they are in reality instruments of power that produce harm and reproduce injustice. For those of us who work on environmental issues, it is very common to hear people say, and please nod if it has happened to you, that they often say that the planet is overpopulated, as though it was an unquestionable truth. The idea circulates almost as a common sense, and everyone assumes it's true. And yet, it is very rarely discussed, rarely challenged. That is why I decided to trace this discourse to follow its history and its transformations. So I decided to really dig into it and trace the origins of this discourse. I tried to trace when people first began to say that the earth was overpopulated. And one of the earliest examples I found comes from Tertullian in a text he wrote called Treatise of the Soul in the year 200 AD. In his treatise, he complained that human numbers were putting pressure on resources in Spain, especially in cities. Let's remember that Tertullian was a Christian writer from Carthage in North Africa. And at that time, the Roman Empire was expanding very fast, and cities were growing, and urban life was becoming crowded and a bit difficult, as he explained. So, even this early, almost 2,000 years ago, we see a familiar concern, the idea that there are too many people. And from there, imagine, from 200 AD, the discourse of overpopulation has never really gone away. It has been reinvented over and over again to explain complex social issues in a very simple way. After Tertullian, I asked myself when else this concern about too many people appear in history. And as you might know, one of the most influential people to talk about this was Thomas Malthus. In his essay on the principle of population, he argued that population grows much faster than food, and that this imbalance would lead to catastrophe. So basically, Malthus said that there would be crisis because population grows geometrically while the production of food grows arithmetically. And when the population would surpass the production of food, then catastrophe would come in the form of famine, poverty, and violence. Even today, when someone explains hunger or environmental collapse as a result of too many people, we are actually repeating Malthus' logic. We say that most environmental thought is Malthusian or neo-Malthusian in its perspective. So Malthus' ideas proved to be extremely durable. They circulated for more than a century, and they influenced governments and economists and scientists, so much that it influenced the Great Development Project that came after World War II. And in this picture that we can see, we have Truman giving a very famous speech in 1949, and from this speech onwards, the world was divided into the developed countries and the underdeveloped countries. He claimed that developed countries had a responsibility to help the poor countries catch up. Instead of recognizing the legacies of colonialism and overexploitation of resources in the global south, the problem was framed as if poor countries themselves were to blame because they were supposedly reproducing too much. Once again, the North presented itself as the one who would help through development projects. Population growth was framed as a barrier to progress, and that is why family planning became the biggest tool of development policy. As Betsy Hartman put it, she has studied development and population policies for decades. She said, well, if overpopulation is a problem, then family planning is a solution, and poor women are the recipients of these services. From the 1950s onwards, family planning became massive across the world. It was presented as a modern, scientific, and a necessary tool for development. But as you all can remember, for many women, especially poor and racialized women in the global south, these programs were often coercive. They were done without women's consent. They were not safe. And entire communities and populations were pressured to reduce their fertility. In the 1960s, there was a real boom in ecological thought. Authors like Rachel Carson and Paul Ehrlich played a crucial role in making the environmental crisis visible. And of course, their contributions were very important. But their analysis often rested on Malthusian assumptions, and they reduced ecological problems to, once again, overpopulation. I believe what was missing was a stronger social science perspective, a gender perspective, and voices that pointed to the role of the economic system, its extractive logic, and the unequal relationships between the North and the South. Without this perspective, then the solutions towards the ecological crisis seemed very simple. We just needed more family planning. But the deeper questions like capitalism, colonialism, and exploitations remained invisible. During the Cold War, family planning was still promoted as a kind of panacea for development, but it was actually a geopolitical strategy. So take the case of Mexico, where I'm from. In the 1970s, there were massive family planning campaigns that transformed how people had children. Today, those campaigns are remembered as the government being very successful with their policies, but they were actually very influenced by the United States. A lot of the resources that came from those campaigns came from the United States. At that time, Washington associated the rapid population growth with political instability, and they associated population growth with communism. Let's remember at the time that China had become the great symbol of communism, but as well as a massive growing population. For the US, the idea of having a neighboring country like Mexico with high birth rates and the potential to become communist became a fear. So in 1974, I found this memorandum, a national security memorandum, that was drafted under Henry Kissinger, and it argued that population growth in countries like India, Mexico, Brazil, and Nigeria was a threat to American interest. So according to this memorandum, a growing population meant the possibility of rebellion in the opposition towards U.S. government. So this is not about conspiracy theories. You can check this memorandum online. It used to be secret, but only recently it became public. And when you read it, the language is very clear. What they want is to reduce the population growth in the global south as a matter of national security for the U.S. And this was like a geopolitical strategy, not only to have influence on those countries, but because they were able to exploit the resources in those countries. Now we know that the framing of overpopulation was not an ecological concern, but it was rather deeply rooted in the historical context of the Cold War. Another problem with overpopulation is how it perpetuates racism. When I searched for overpopulation in Google, these are some of the images that I saw. And as you can see, these images that circulate of are of poor people, as if they're a crowd without control. They are moving, like advancing towards us as a threat. These are the images that we see often when we're thinking about ecological crisis, but we almost never see images of overconsumption, of luxury cars, of the lifestyles of the world richest 1%. Instead, what we see is poor people in the South displayed as a face of the crisis. This is very problematic because we're placing the blame of the crisis on those who are least responsible and those who are most vulnerable. So, population programs were very highly criticized because of the harm that they were doing to a lot of women. As I said, a lot of them were coercive and they just wanted to lower fertility rates, and they were not thinking about the well-being of the women in the global South. And so a lot of these stopped. They stopped around the world. But now we can see new forms of population control in the form of conservation projects. So these projects called Population, Health, and Environment started in the 1990s. They combine family planning with conservation in biodiversity hotspots. So the idea was that if women use contraception and have fewer children, they would put less pressure on the ecosystems. But once again, women's and particularly poor women's bodies became the focus, and their reproduction was framed as a solution to climate change. This, of course, obscures the real drivers of environmental crisis, such as the extractive economies and fossil fuels and industrial agriculture. And instead of holding corporations and the biggest polluters, countries in the world accountable, we put the weight of planetary survival on poor women. So these programs are being led by both conservation organizations and population organizations. Before Trump and before the dismantling of the USAID, most of these programs were funded by USAID, were funded by the US, and they were all over the world, but most particularly in Asia and Africa. So as you can see in this image, a lot of these programs are in Eastern Africa, and they're in areas where it's very hard to reach. And so a lot of these organizations say that women are very happy with the projects, but it's very difficult to go there and assess that information. So these programs are very sexist and racist. Women are depicted as hyper fertile, primitive, passive, as though they're just waiting for the West to give them these types of aid. And reproductive justice is reduced to helping women have less children. But if they want to have more children because they are infertile, for example, they don't receive that kind of help. And it's very convenient because the problem is depicted somewhere else in distant places and not placed in the global north. So let me give you briefly some numbers. Oxfam reported in 2023 that the richest 1% of humanity pollutes as much as the poorest 2/3 combined. In 2019, the richest 1% were responsible for 16% of global carbon emissions. So, this is the real crisis, not population growth, but extreme inequality. And when we are focusing on overpopulation, we are looking at the wrong place. We are blaming the powerless, the most vulnerable, particularly women, and we are excusing the most responsible for driving this ecological crisis. To conclude, I want to insist that we need to shift the focus of our conversation and our narratives. We need to talk openly about capitalism in its extractive phase. It is one of the central drivers of ecological collapse. We need to talk about the deep inequalities in production and consumption. We need to talk about how resources are extracted, consumed, and wasted, which is often in very unequal ways between North and South, between rich and poor. We cannot ignore the role of wars in global arms industry. We cannot ignore the role that AI is taking in the overconsumption of water and resources. And at the same time, we need to stop placing the attention on women's body, particularly those of poor and racialized women, as they were the root of the problem. No, these women are among the least responsible for the ecological crisis. We need to start speaking of how to take care of them and stop placing the blame on them. And we need to reframe our narratives. We need new stories grounded in justice, in care, and in solidarity. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure being here.